access to mental health care varies greatly across this province, and while money plays a big part in that, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, approach and context matter too. So, in light of appalling levels of youth suicide, addiction, and other mental health problems, is it time for some new thinking to get better outcomes? Joining us now to consider that via Skype from London, Ontario, Gerald McKinley. He's a professor in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Western University and a researcher at CanBind. That's the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression. And here in our studio, Suzanne Stewart, director of the Waakabeness Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto. And Suzanne, it's good to have you back on our program. Gerald, I think the first time we've had you on, so nice that you could join us from London, Ontario. I want actually, Suzanne, to start with your last visit here, which was about a year and a half ago. We talked about the youth suicide crisis in Attawapiskat, and this is what you said then about that. Sheldon, if you please.
Communities that have high levels of resources, connection to traditional culture, including language, control of education, control of infrastructure, like police and medical services, have very low rates of suicide. And communities that have very little of what's termed cultural continuity seem to have very high rates.
Let me pick up right there. You refer to the traditional culture and language as being so important to good mental health. Why have some Indigenous communities had such a difficult time hanging on to those two things in particular?
Well, that's kind of a long-winded answer, really, but I'll give you the shortened version. And what it really has to do with is colonialism in the terms of the taking away of things. The Indian Act was instituted in Canada in the late 1800s to exterminate Indigenous people by taking away their identity, by taking away their culture, by taking away their land. And one of the outcomes of that attempt to exterminate a population could be viewed as the current suicide crisis.
Gerald, can I get you to respond to that as well? The notion of traditional culture and language being so difficult to maintain, and therefore the mental health ramifications that Suzanne just referred to.
Yeah, I would agree completely. Certainly the history and the ongoing history of colonization in Canada has played an important or significant role in the development of the suicide problem in the northern community, in Indigenous communities. And we're not making it easy for the youth to access their culture when we take them away from their communities to go to high school, when the dominant languages that they're learning in school may not be their own. So it's, yeah, I have very little to add to what Dr. Stewart said.
Okay, on that note of consensus, then let me follow up with something else that, Suzanne, I need help understanding here. Another piece of this puzzle is that if you're on a remote Indigenous community, you often don't have access to the wide range of services you might have in urban centers. But in urban centers, surely it is more difficult to hang on to your traditional language and your traditional culture because you're living in a city of 2.5 million people, for example. Can you make sense of that apparent conundrum for me?
Well, it may on the surface appear as a conundrum, but in reality, Indigenous people gather in cities and create communities, cultural communities that are as strong and vibrant as they are on remote reserved communities. And in fact, my experience has been that Indigenous knowledges and traditional practices are often stronger in cities and communities that are less dominantly affected in an everyday way by missionization that's happened on reserves, where the obliteration of traditional knowledges and traditional healing practices, for example, have really been in full effect due to the Catholic Church.
So we should not misinterpret the fact that they may be thousands of kilometers away from their traditional land as being therefore out of touch with language, out of touch with tradition.
Well, in reality, Indigenous people, whether they're in the city or in the country or on their reserve, are on the land. And Indigenous people, and all people in my worldview, have a spiritual connection to the land, whatever that land is underneath them.
Okay. Gerald, let me go to you next then, that background having been put in place. With the latest research that you're going to share with us regarding the Ontario Brain Institute coming to the conclusion that it had something to offer on trying to improve a lot of the social issues that we're going to be discussing tonight. Fill us in.
Certainly. So the group I work with, as you mentioned, CanBind, is funded by the Ontario Brain Institute that has a mandate to improve health outcomes for Ontarians. And a big part of what the group's trying to do, what CanBind and the OBI are trying to do is based through that outreach and getting out into the communities in order to take what's happening in the research that we're doing, our teams are doing in their labs, but also partnering that with what we're learning from the community. So we're going into the communities not as mental health experts, but as learners, so that we can better understand and learn from our partners what it is that they want, so that we can start tailoring the research that's happening on mental health around things like depression and addictions and suicide to the lived realities. And CanBind does that with First Nations, as well as partnered with the Mood Disorder Association of Ontario to do it with other people with lived experience.
Just take us down the road a bit, though. What is it that you ultimately hope to bring to this issue that you think has been missing so far?
Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rethink knowledge translation away from being one directional from the labs to, say, a healthcare practitioner, and making it into something that's more of a conversational relationship, a back and forth. And we're trying to partner things like the social determinants of health, which is actually my area. I'm not a lab researcher. I'm an anthropologist. We're trying to partner what we're learning about social determinants, but also what does that mean with research into, say, even epigenetics or other areas of the heart or the bench sciences.
Suzanne, do you think CanBind has something new to bring to this issue?
Well, it certainly sounds like what they're doing is in a really great direction in terms of taking up the ethic of reciprocity in the relationship between research and the uptake of knowledge from research.
What would be your hopes, though, of what ultimately might come from all of this?
Well, my view really is grounded in a discourse that has moved beyond the idea of sharing worldviews to deal with Indigenous mental health problems, and has really moved to a place where I feel like it's time for the Canadian healthcare system, especially mental health, to move aside and allow Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges to be at the front and center rather than next to or beside or even othered to the dominant ways of dealing with mental health. Because mental health for Indigenous people is really a social and political construct, not a biological or technical process.
Gerald, do you agree with that?
I do. And when we think about a holistic model of health, we can't only focus on the biological. We need to be thinking about the spiritual and the emotional and the mental. And the programming that we've been doing at the community level is actually guided by elders and youth in the community around what their expectations are of what it means to be a healthy individual living a good life.
Here's what the feds had to say about that 12 years ago. And I'm going to read from a report now called Acting on What We Know, Preventing Youth Suicide in First Nations. This is from Health Canada. In 2001, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Matthew Kuncum, and former Minister of Health, Alan Rock, appointed a panel of 8 Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers and health practitioners to make recommendations regarding the prevention of suicide among First Nations youth. The members of the Suicide Prevention Advisory Group were selected by the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch of Health Canada and the Assembly of First Nations for their knowledge and experience in the areas of suicide prevention, health promotion, and First Nations community development. Suzanne, as I say, 12 years ago that was put in place. How much success did this initiative have in your view?
Well, do you want the candy-coated answer?
No,
or do you
I want
the real answer?
I want the straight goods. What do you think we invited you here for?
Well, you sort of know me, and you know that I kind of, I'm a straight shooter. So I'll be quite honest in saying that I don't really think that has been followed through in the true spirit that might have been meant to be, because it's really not in the interest of Canada for Indigenous people to be healthy.
Why do you say that?
because it's in the interest of Canada to oppress and colonize Indigenous people in order to continue to access the resources that are on traditional lands.
You think the pursuit of those resources that are on traditional Indigenous land, the pursuit is more easily done if the Crown continues to keep Indigenous communities in crisis?
Absolutely. Canada was built on the premise that there's an Indian problem. Canada was built, everyone who lives here who's not Indigenous has what they have as a result of the Indian Act, as a result of harm to a group of original peoples. And what reconciliation is really about in mental health care and in Canada in general is about righting the wrongs of colonization, righting the wrongs of the Indian Act. So any person in Canada who has benefited from the Indian Act really has a responsibility as part of reconciliation to make right the harms that have happened through their profession, through their lives, through their relationships, because they benefited from that, from the creation of what we have right now.
Okay, Gerald, I bet you sign on to the second part of that answer, but I wonder what you think of the first part of what she had to say.
I think I'm just going to stumble here for a second. I think when we look at a lot of the communities that we're talking about, I think we're right when we say that we haven't gone far enough. We haven't done enough with actually supporting them. And when we talk about the ongoing colonization and the history in terms of economic developments and the benefits that have gone to Canada, not to the Indigenous populations, we don't need to look outside of the province of Ontario. If you look at the history in the area of Treaty 9, when that treaty was signed, and then after that, and the role that Canada played in moving people onto reserve, away from their traditional lifestyles, changing food, changing educational structures, changing social structures, in order to give Canada access to the mineral resources, the forestry resources that are there. It's not hard to make the connection between those actions and the current suicide crisis.
You know, I got a feeling we could do a whole program on that, and I could take us along a different road than the two of you came in to speak about today. So I'm going to stop my natural inquisitiveness on that angle and get us back on the road we came to talk about, which is improvements in mental health. In terms of making improvements in mental health initiatives, do you think that the efforts of this country tap into the elders of your communities adequately to make progress? Suzanne.
Absolutely not.
What should they be doing?
Well, I continue to see Western experts making decisions for Indigenous people in the patriarchal and colonial relationship that Canada as a country and institutions and schools and cities and communities have with Indigenous communities, whether they're First Nations communities or whether they're urban communities. And part of that is the framing of Indigenous mental health. So for example, throughout our time together tonight, we've already said suicide crisis a number of times, when in fact, it's not really a suicide crisis outside of the construction of that, because these are problems that have been going on for a long time. It didn't just happen. These are also problems that are happening in very small communities with small numbers of people that aren't actually an accurate representation of the demography of Indigenous people.
Can I follow up with Gerald on that aspect in particular? Because I want to ask him whether you think official health response in Canada is focused on the right elements within Indigenous populations to make improvements to mental health.
I think at the official level, no, we're not. What we get is a crisis response. So we're responding after the fact instead of spending time, enhancing the strengths in a community, or rather supporting the community to enhance the strengths as they feel they need to. And we talk about the suicide crisis, which in messaging itself is really, I think, dangerous. When you look at communities that don't have suicides, if you're a youth in that community and you're hearing First Nations youth described as being in suicide crisis, what's that going to do to you? is that going to place, and Michael Krall's done a lot of work on this, is that going to, transmit the idea socially about this as something that becomes an identity? So I think we need to be shifting towards prevention, but we need to be shifting to prevention in a way that it's the communities guiding it and owning it, and asking and getting the resources they want for the prevention rather than responding after the fact. And certainly the crisis teams are important after the fact, but they shouldn't be the answer.
Well, what I'm about to read may be a somewhat more positive take on the issue. Jane Philpott used to be the Health Minister for Canada. She's now the Minister of Indigenous Services. But 3 or 4 months ago, when she was still in health, she said this: 2 weeks ago, I visited communities in Northern Ontario where the crisis continues to have a devastating impact. When I visited Woonaman Lake First Nation, I learned about their Choose Life project. This initiative will address suicide risk factors, particularly among youth, through on-the-land activities and programs for children to increase self-esteem and strengthen families. This type of community-led programming is critical to solving this crisis. Okay, Suzanne, is she onto something with that?
Absolutely. The prevention and the strengths-based approaches are really what needs to happen. And working from a lens that does not include deficit or disease-based models of either prevention or intervention are probably going to be what's more successful, because that's what's been used all this time.
What does that mean? Sorry, deficit or
so
disease-based
models? The Canadian model of health and mental health is based on a Western European lens of health, which is a deficit model, an illness model.
Okay.
Indigenous models of health are not based on deficits. They're based on strengths and wellness, or what's called balance. When we look at things like what she was talking about, what we're really trying to identify is understanding how we can look at this problem of suicide before it becomes a problem. So what can we do to put things in place so these problems don't arise?
Gerald, in our last minute and change here, I am curious a bit about your background and what brought you to this issue, because, well, tell us, where are you from originally?
I come from Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Okay, so you don't have a history of Indigenous relation difficulties in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
No.
You get that from coming here. So where does the interest come from?
It comes from just my own learning. I did my undergraduate training at Trent University in what was the Native Studies program, is now Indigenous Studies, in part because I wanted to learn about my own country's history of colonization, and they offered the post-colonial theory course. And as anyone that works closely with First Nations will tell you, relationships are really important. And while I was there, I started forming good relationships, and people who have been in my life for a long time and have guided my learning. So that's how I've come into this, is just through relationships and meeting people.
Okay, well, I thank both of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us learn more about what you are both learning and teaching. Suzanne Stewart, Gerald McKinley, thanks so much for being here with us tonight.
Merci, Cho.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.